In terms of the foundational approach to optimizing our circadian health and our circadian rhythm is make watching the sunrise an absolute priority. The combination of the morning coffee on the empty stomach, trying to do a time restricted eat at the same time as looking at the iPhone first thing in the morning. To me, that is a holy trinity of circadian disrupting, metabolism disrupting behaviors that people do these days. DHA is critical for eye development, it's critical for brain development, it's critical for the transduction of light signals into the brain. The modern environment that we live in, which is rich in this artificial blue light, increases or accelerates the destruction of DHA in the retina and in our central nervous system. Food is medicine, light is medicine. You can get these natural nutrients now, or you can deal with the consequences and chronic disease later down the track.
Max, what would you say is the ideal human diet?
That's a great question. And I think the missing piece that a lot of influencers or people who are discussing this topic online and in public forums really miss is the question about what is seasonally appropriate. And that is a deeper question that moves past these kind of dietary camps of carnivore, vegetarian, vegan, and all these ideological positions that people often get their egos kind of invested in. And not to diminish anyone's experience. And obviously, people have certain protocols that they followed that enable them to improve their health to a certain degree. But if we are thinking about what is the best diet for any one individual, it's really a contextual question and a contextual answer. So the way I think about it is that what is appropriate diet is what is going to be seasonally available in someone's environment at that latitude, at that season, at that time of year. So say perhaps in the winter, if you're living in America, if you're living in New York or Canada, what is available and abundant at that time is going to be very restricted from a plant food point of view. You're predominantly going to be getting animals, which is other mammals that can actually exist and live in those conditions. So the extension or the corollary of that point is that it is more appropriate to be eating a lower carbohydrate, more ketogenic, perhaps even carnivore type diet during that time of year. Because again, that is simply about what is available at that time. And conversely, as the season changes and there is more UV light around and the plants are able to grow and there's different abundance of, say, plant foods in people that are metabolically healthy, meaning they don't have a lot of visceral fat, they don't have insulin resistance, they don't have leptin resistance, then consuming some local sources of carbohydrates like berries, like things that are growing, again, at that latitude is going to be fine. But to port that a diet, whether that's a carnivore, into the equator in summer, or the reverse, which is to take a fruit-based, higher carb diet and port that into the New York winter, that is a mismatch. That's a seasonal mismatch. And I believe that is a major driving force behind people getting sick and where people come off the rails when it comes to their diet and their eating strategy.
Okay, so to kind of summarize what you've gone over here, we want to change the diet depending on the seasons, depending on where we're living, and depending on if we're metabolically healthy, we can include some plants in that. So if somebody isn't metabolically healthy, they're better off just erring on the side of more animal products until they regain that? Is that what you're saying there?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And the big picture behind what we have to really think about is that the number of people that have one marker of metabolic syndrome in America is, cresting above in the high 80s of percent. And what I mean by that is we have markers of essentially metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is this constellation of risk factors that together put you at high risk of developing diabetes, stroke, heart disease, dementia, cancer, all these problems that essentially put people in nursing homes. They are increased if we have these signs of metabolic syndrome. And the 5 signs of metabolic syndrome are high triglycerides, low HDL, high waist circumference, high blood pressure and high blood glucose level. So 88% of US adults have at least one of those markers, meaning that collectively as a population, people aren't well. And we can go into the kind of factors that have led them there. But what we need to do is have an understanding of where we are on that scale of metabolic health. And as you put very well, Jesse, is to err on the side of a lower carb diet if some of those metabolic health parameters are off. And what happens clinically, what we find clinically, is that people improve on a lower carb diet if they have metabolic disease. That is basically unrefutable at this point, and that is something that I've noticed in my clinic and many others have. I guess the controversy comes about in terms of what diet should people stay on. And I believe, again, if they've healed their metabolic disease, if you're metabolically healthy and the reason why you had to institute a diet in terms of a medical or a therapeutic protocol is now gone away, then now have a framework in terms of this seasonal eating idea to eat a bit more and not necessarily be bound by a rigid ideology. But as always, it goes back to what makes you feel the best. And some people feel the best on a strict carnivore diet, and that's okay. And some people feel better if they have things like fermented vegetables. The end of the day, the individual variation is vast, and how people feel is going to make a lot of difference, especially about what diet people can stick to for the rest of the life. But the crux of the matter is it's a really dynamic and contextual answer. And when someone is sick is different to when they're better, and when they're traveling or living in a northern versus equatorial latitude, it's all very dynamic. And I like to give an example of, I think, that really hones this point home, which is Dr. Paul Saladino, who you've interviewed on your podcast, who's a very intelligent and very well-spoken kind of leader of the carnivore diet. And he went from a strict carnivore with no plant products at all, to which healed his eczema, to then finding that he was getting flagging electrolyte levels, fatigue, hypnagogic jerks, and lower testosterone level, higher serum sex-binding globulin, all these non-desirable findings from maintaining this really strict low-carb carnivore diet. And that was his prompt to move to include fruit and honey. But I think the key point, and maybe I'll discuss this with Paul one day, is that he was living, as far as I'm aware, he was living in Costa Rica when he was getting all those problems. And again, the carnivore would have been appropriate living in the wintertime in the Northern Hemisphere. But if you're trying to maintain a carnivore diet at the equator, when you're sweating that much and having all these electrolyte losses, the lack of insulin from locally sourced fruit, honey, etc., is going to make it difficult to hang on to sodium. And that is exactly what he noticed. And that's why he's become an advocate for including those foods. But the nuance is that diet is still not going to be appropriate for someone who remains in a winter, high latitude, lower temperature location where their light environment and their temperature environment is fundamentally different to the basically 12-hour day, 12-hour night, stable temperature equatorially.
If you're enjoying this episode, let me know by clicking like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the show. Given what you said earlier about erring on the side of caution if somebody's metabolically unhealthy and going more towards the animal products, would that be true given what you just said about Paul and being near the equator? For somebody who's metabolically unhealthy near the equator, would they still want to go more animal-based till they regain their metabolic health?
I think it still holds. I think the point is that we've got a bit more latitude when we're in a light environment with a high UV yield. And this is borne out in animal experiments. And they essentially had two groups of mice, and they exposed one to ultraviolet light. And again, this is narrowband. It's not mimicking the exact sun as you would get naturally. But what they found was the mice that were exposed to the ultraviolet light had resistance to obesity and metabolic syndrome offered by a higher fat, which is essentially code for seed oil and carb-rich mouse diet. So what that shows is that there's an influence of our light environment on our metabolic health and the metabolic effect of different food. And when our circadian rhythm is aligned, then and we're getting, which it necessarily implies sufficient full spectrum sunlight during the day and a complete absence of light at night. When those criteria are met and when our circadian rhythm is dialed, then we have this latitude to deal with deviations from a strict diet, so to speak. And again, that's not to advocate eating, junk food if you're on the equator, but there is some latitude offered again by that light environment. And the reason for this is because the metabolic organs in our body, the gut, the liver, the pancreas, the fat tissue, they all have their own circadian timing mechanisms, and they regulate the turnover of things like our gut lining. And when that system is operating optimally, then things like the turnover over our gut cells, the barrier function of our gut is very, very, very much improved. So, deviating from that ideal situation, say if we're exposed to artificial light or the circadian rhythm is wrong or we're living in that seasonal mismatch, then we're more likely or more prone to developing things like metabolic syndrome, leaky gut, et cetera, because the system is less able to deal with deviations from a very, very, diet that is completely absent of any form of toxin, plant toxin, or anything else. So, again, it's taking a holistic picture of health and not basing our concept of metabolic health solely on the food ingested, but also about the environment that we're existing in with regard to light, temperature, and season, because those are the fundamental inputs environmentally that influence our mitochondrial function. At the end of the day, the mitochondria are what are burning these fuels and what are powering the whole organism.
How quickly do these changes take place in the body? Somebody like me in Ontario, if I go on vacation in Florida, is it pretty instantaneous when I get to that new environment that I change my diet up and my body will be adapted to that?
Yeah, so it will take a couple of days and to synchronize again fully in terms of the circadian signals. And to give people a bit more of an explanation, the idea behind a circadian rhythm is essentially this idea that your body runs a roughly 24-hour clock. And the clock is not exactly 24 hours, so it requires these input signals from the environment. The main one is light, and the most important one is light. These are also called Zeitgebers. So light influences our circadian timing, so does temperature, as I mentioned. So does meal timing, so does social activity, so does activity. So it's basically a way of the body collecting information. So it can time the process of activity and hormonal secretion, behavior, or everything that we need to operate our physiology at the correct time. And that is what the circadian rhythm essentially is. So the interesting implication of disruptions of the circadian rhythm, and I alluded this before, is that if you take mice and you start knocking out specific genes that regulate this 24-hour cycle, you induce obesity in them, again, without changing anything that they're eating, which is borne out in population level data of shift workers who have a greatly raised likelihood of developing obesity, cancer, type 2 diabetes, because they're simply awake at the wrong time and they're active when they should be asleep. And you can see the same thing if you take mice and you put a group on a shift work mimicking schedule, and their fat tissue essentially becomes fibrotic. It develops inflammation, and they become insulin resistant. So those are links between our circadian system and metabolism. In terms of synchronizing everything. The moment you land in Florida, you have a job, and that job is to collect as much data about your local environment to feed into your eyes, to your brain, and to your peripheral clocks as possible, because it's a data and information gathering exercise. And the quicker you can do that by getting out, by grounding your feet on the earth, by seeing the sun, specifically the morning sun, by exposing your body with minimal clothing onto the ambient air temperature, by eating during daylight hours, the more of these things you can do, and obviously blocking blue light after dark, the quicker your body will synchronize back up to those local situation, and the quicker you will be thriving again. And the food is a signal in itself, and the seasonality or the locality of the food, if it's grown locally, again, is essentially providing a congruent signal with all those other sensors that your mitochondria are processing and then integrating. So the answer is yes, it will happen quite quickly, but we have to be diligent and intentional and conscious about our behaviors and our lifestyle when we're thinking about optimal mitochondrial and circadian health.
And what you just talked about can be applied back to day in, day out living back at home. We want to make sure we're getting out in our environment, giving our body these inputs on a continuous basis to keep our circadian rhythm and our health balanced.
Yeah, exactly right. And the biggest challenge is to adhere to these circadian requirements in our modern age. And not to sound too abrupt, but your circadian biology doesn't care that you have to work shift work. It doesn't care that your boss refuses to turn the fluorescent light bulbs off. Your body has these very, very ancient and adapted needs with respect to its light environment. And when we disrespect those, because we have our own higher cognitive capability to disrespect our fundamental bodily needs, then we get sick. And this is a problem that animals don't have to contend with. The bear is grounded, the whole time. The bear goes to sleep when the sun goes down. The bear wakes up on sunrise. He is only eating locally sourced food unless he's, been diving in Yosemite National Park. But the point is, this is all intuitive and second nature to animals because they lack these frontal lobes that essentially allow us to disobey and disregard Mother Nature's rules. But Mother Nature doesn't care, and essentially the consequence of disrespecting these circadian rules is that we get sick, and we're seeing that in real time. And the fact that, as we mentioned, 88% of Americans have one marker of metabolic dysfunction, the fact that cancer, autoimmune disease, all these problems, dementia, are rising in incidence and prevalence, and they fundamentally have a root in mitochondria and mitochondrial health and mitochondrial dysfunction. And the accumulation of mutations over lifetime and the rate of accumulation of mitochondrial mutation over your life is what's going to determine how soon or not you essentially become sick. And this answers the question about, is it genetic, is it environment? And people can often get in the trap or and become self-indulgent in just simply blaming their genes for poor health. But when we understand that mitochondrial health is the root of these chronic diseases and modern diseases of the West, then we realize that environmental inputs are everything. And the environment, your sleep patterns, your exercise, your food sourcing, all these, the temperature that you expose yourself to, these are all going to be inputting into your mitochondrial health. And if you decide to live in a cubicle at 24 degrees for 12 months a year, and with 18 hours of isolated blue illumination from your LED bulbs and your iPad screen, then don't be surprised if you fall unwell, because again, you're disrespecting Mother Nature's requirements and your circadian biology.
All right, let's get really practical. Given that most of us are going to be living in the modern world, living in the Western world with a lot of these inputs that we want to avoid, where does somebody begin? We have all these different inputs. We're going to stay, within our environment to a point, but practically, how do we begin to get back to nature?
It's a very good question. And again, it depends on how sick or not we are. The sicker we are, and by that I mean, full blown diabetes, and already have cancer diagnoses, you've already got a crippling autoimmune disease. If that is the case, then you should really consider moving to a lower latitude. The reason for that is because it is easier to exist on a day-to-day level in a way that respects those circadian signals. So it's much easier to live in Hawaii, Florida, Costa Rica, Thailand, because the day length are equal. And to be awake for 12 hours and be asleep for 12 hours and rise with the sun and set with this and go to sleep with the sun is a lot easier than trying to manage that very, very far north, 38th latitude. So that is the first point. Again, it depends on how sick or not we are. And it's always a consideration that sometimes you just have to move. But for those people that aren't yet there, but are interested in taking charge of their circadian health and respecting those rules that I've mentioned, is to start with our light environment. And the reason I emphasize light above food is because the influence of light on our bodily processes is so vast that it essentially it trumps food in terms of influencing factor. So what I would recommend is to start with the sunrise. And this is as simple as going out in the morning, planting your feet on the bare ground and watching the sunrise. And if you have to wear shoes, that's okay, but at least get the sun in your eyes. And by watching the sunrise, I don't mean with sunglasses, with eyeglasses. It really has to be with your unexposed eyes. And that is because any form of anything in between your eyes and the sun is a form of filtration, and it is transforming what the download from the sun to your brain, and therefore altering the way your body will respond. So it's all about, again, collecting the most high fidelity signal, and things like sunglasses, things like contact lenses will again influence that by changing the proportion of wavelengths that reach your eye and therefore your brain. So it starts with watching the sunrise and not missing a morning sunrise, because that morning download of information will set you up not only for the rest of the day, but also into that night. And hormones like serotonin, melatonin, these essentially get set and loaded for release later in the day and later in the night. So in terms of the foundational approach to optimizing our circadian health and our circadian rhythm is make watching the sunrise an absolute priority. And if you can, don't miss another one.
So hearing you explain that exercise in the morning, it sounds like there's a few different inputs that we're getting from that. The light sounds like it's the biggest piece, but also the grounding. And then naturally being outside, we're going to be exposed to whatever the temperature is in that area in that season. So are all those important? And is there any other variables that happen out there that I'm not thinking of?
They're all very important, exactly as you say. And to give people a bit of an idea about the information they're receiving, as the sun rises, the wavelengths of light that are present at sunrise are different compared to midday, compared to mid-morning, compared to later in the day. So the morning has blue light to wake you up. It stimulates alertness and allows you to start the day, and secreting some stress hormones, increasing your secretion of cortisol. But that is appropriately so. But it also has infrared light and red light. And the key point is that the blue light that you get in the morning is always balanced by red and infrared. And it's unlike the blue light that people are exposed to, every day, which is only blue by itself. And this is a kind of, maybe you can use an analogy to fruit and fructose. If you purify fructose out of, a locally grown mango, then the effect that is going to have on someone's health if they drink purified fructose is different to if they eat a whole mango. So taking the blue light out of and exposing ourselves to just blue light through a TV screen, an iPad, or a downlight is completely different to the blue light that we get from the sun. So just to make that point abundantly clear. But the light nutrients that we receive at sunrise are red, they're infrared, and they're, again, a little bit of blue. But notice that it's a balance of visible and non-visible. So that's the key light signals that we get. And as you mentioned, yes, temperature is key, because temperature helps to inform us of latitude and altitude, and the grounding too. So the next point, or the next important Zeitgeber, is actually food and meal timing, and eating protein and fat rich breakfast close after maybe half an hour to 45 minutes following the sunrise is another important Zeitgeber for things like digestion, for your gut, the peripheral clock in your gut to realize that the day is started. And when it comes to treating and helping people with obesity, metabolic disease, the genesis, or the kind of precursor issue in this line of metabolic problems, is leptin resistance. And leptin resistance, or leptin, is this hormone that the fat cells make to tell the body how much energy is on board. That is a circadian hormone that relies on light signals. So reestablishing leptin sensitivity, or kind of fixing the fuel gauge to know how much fuel's in the tank, it needs that morning sunrise. And it is highly improved or facilitated by that nutrient dense breakfast soon after watching the sunrise. But those are essentially the morning cues that are very, very important. And notice how it's not all about diet. It's about what is the context of our environment, and what are those environmental signals that therefore being transmitted to or being sensed by our mitochondria.
As you explain all that, one of the things that pops up for me is, ideally, obviously, is to go to nature and do what you said. But for somebody that, say, sleeps in or has something going on in the morning and they can't take the time to do what you just went through, are there hacks that we can bring into the home to get the nutrients that come from light in a biohacked form, grounding in a biohacked form, temperature, that is something we could biohack? I don't want to sway away from doing it the natural way. That is what obviously would be the best. But so people can make it, again, fit into the modern world, or even if it's just periodically, if they miss that morning, can we hack that inside with different modalities?
It's a good question. And I would really say that some is better than none, and don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So what that means is, if you can get outside and see 1 minute, 30 seconds of sun rising, that is better than none. And you don't have to sit out there for half an hour. It's not essential. Again, it depends on how sick you are, but some is better than none. So again, don't strive for perfection. What it can look like, if you're busy, if you're on the road, is to essentially just walk outside even on the way to the car, and maybe pause for 30 seconds. So those are the workarounds that I'd really encourage for people who really want to, or are unable to do that. There's a raft of other things that we can use. And again, this is in a framework that I like to use, which is I call it the 3 M's framework. The first M is for maximize these natural circadian signals. The second is minimize artificial light, and the third is mitigate wherever possible. So if we can't maximize, or we've kind of done as much as we can in terms of those practices that I've already mentioned, then the next step in terms of minimization is things like don't leave the lights too bright first thing in the morning, because instead of getting that gentle morning sunrise blue light, you're essentially getting as- the meth hit of LED full blast blue light in the morning. So that is incredibly disruptive and interfering with our circadian timing mechanism. So things like bright phones first thing in the morning, like scrolling, things like bright light overhead. It is sending a very confusing message to the body. So wearing blue light blocking glasses like orange or red glasses prior to sunrise is a very good recommendation or hack. Um, Things like cold, we can use cold. It's again best to do that outside, but simply, not many people like to, but if you can do something like a colder bath first thing in the morning is helpful. And grounding mats, there's a little bit of nuance around grounding mats, and it's to do with the the electricity basically grid in your area, and if your power points are truly grounded, and it can be a little bit problematic, and we don't want to introduce more problems than we are looking to solve. But suffice to say, the blue light blockers are probably the best thing to start with for people trying to do their best around the circadian signals.
When you're talking about getting this morning light, you mentioned the fact we want to take our glasses off, contact lenses, and sunglasses. How much of the light exposure we're getting when we go outside and do that is through the eyes when we take those off versus the skin?
So that's a good question, and it bears out to explain a little bit more about the way that our body sense light. And the eye has these functions that are both image forming and photo receiving, and in a non-visual way. So what that means is that my eye is acting like a camera, so I can see you now, Jesse, but it is also acting to detect the presence and absence of certain wavelengths of light, specifically blue light, and those are a special group of cells in our retina called the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, and they go straight to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that master clock in the brain. They also go to a region of the brain that's involved in mood. So it's a very direct pathway to explain why blue light toxicity or technology addiction leads to depression, is because you have a synapse directly from these cells to a part of the brain called the habenular nucleus, which influences mood. But the point about these non-visual photoreceptors is that they can't tell you, they're not forming an image in front of you. They're saying, is there blue light, yes or no? And obviously responding to different intensities of that light. But the same type of photosensitive proteins, those in those non-visual photoreceptors, also exist in the skin. And they are expressed in a range of cells in the skin, which means that our skin is able to detect light just like our eyes are. And that's a very important finding, because it implies that as much as possible, we should be getting our skin in the sun, in that morning sun, as well as just our face and our eyes. So it's the overwhelming influence is going to be ocular, but we can't neglect the fact that we also need to get our skin in the game.
So now that we know that the skin is affected by light as well, this will come into play when we talk about blocking junk light. We need to make sure we're blocking the eyes and now the skin as well.
Yeah, I like to say that people should think of themselves as when they're under artificial light, and the sand people in Star Wars from Tatooine that walk around wearing completely covered up from head to toe. That's essentially what we need to think about when we're under artificial light, because those isolated blue wavelengths are going to be contributing to misalignment of our circadian rhythm.
As we're talking about glasses and contact lenses and sunglasses blocking in the morning and making sure we take those off, it also connects to getting a sunburn. I've heard you talk about this on another show, the fact that if we're wearing sunglasses, It actually makes our skin on our body more prone to becoming sunburn. Talk about the physiology there.
Yeah, so it gets to this idea that the eye is a neuroendocrine organ. And what that means is it's an extension of the brain, but it has profound influence on the secretion of hormones. And the reason is because those light signals go from the eye to the hypothalamus, to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and then straight to the pituitary gland. And the way to think about the pituitary gland is like a pharmacy of your brain. It is coordinating or producing a bunch of very, very important hormonal mediators that are involved in the adrenal axis, the gonadal axis to do with reproduction, obviously the endocrine function. It's coordinating and centralizing all those signals. So what how this relates to sunburn is, and basically tanning more generally, is that one of the key hormones that is involved in is in tanning and in a whole bunch of processes is called pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC. And this was essentially the a research, it was a pet research project of scientists looking in various domains. But it wasn't until basically Dr. Jack Kruse really put the pieces together for understanding how POMC incorporates into health and specifically light. So when you cut up this POMC, essentially pro hormone, it's a master peptide pro hormone. So it gets cut up into all these other peptide hormones. One of those is called alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, or alpha MSH. And alpha MSH, especially when it's expressed locally in the skin, tells your melanocytes to make melanin and therefore to darken your skin. But the effect of alpha MSH in the brain is also to turn off hunger signals. So it is one of the most powerful satiety signals that we have. And if we think about what I mentioned earlier about leptin, is that leptin that tells our body about how much energy we have on board is porting back or downloading information from the periphery, from our body, back to POMC expressing neurons in the hypothalamus. The point is that that circuit takes information from alpha MSH, which is secreted, to tell us that we've eaten enough and that we don't need to keep eating, amongst other signals. So the implication for that is that if we are wearing sunglasses and we're not getting enough UV light, because UV light stimulates the release of pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC, then if we're not making enough POMC, we're not stimulating, we're not making enough alpha MSH, then we are going to be more hungry. And that is because we're essentially deficient in this really, really important satiety hormone. So that is the link between metabolism and our light environment. And if someone is indoors all day, they're not making POMC in their skin or their eyes and their brain, then they're going to be hungrier. They're going to be craving carbs. They're going to be craving these low quality foods. But when you also block the light from your eyes, but you still have sunlight on your skin, then you're sending an incongruent message between that the control center of the brain, the neuroendocrine organ, master organ, the eyes and the skin, and you're therefore more likely to sunburn, because the signals are again incongruent between those two levels, and you're not sending your body a consistent or homogeneous message about what is going on in its environment. So that is the little known implication of wearing sunglasses on health. But if we think about it holistically, it's all about what is the light environment that our bodies evolved with, and how are we messing with that? Just like we're refining food, we're refining light. And the wearing sunglasses is just another form of essentially junk light that we are presenting to our bodies in place of the real thing.
Tying another couple pieces to this skin being more sensitive to the UV light, isn't it true that getting that morning sun in our eyes later in the day will help us prevent against getting sunburned. And I also believe there's certain foods we can take in that act as kind of an internal sunscreen as well.
Yes, that is exactly correct. And the reason is because red light and the red wavelengths specifically influence the essentially a range of chemicals produced by fibroblasts, and they essentially prepare the skin for the ultraviolet light that arrives later in the day. So if you imagine that, and again for your listeners, ultraviolet light, depending on your latitude, is not present the whole day. It's only present for a fraction of the time. But what you're doing is that nature designed the system perfectly so that when you're walking on the savannah, in our ancestral past, you would have maximized that red light on our essentially naked bodies. So the skin is ready for ultraviolet. We would have had some degree of ultraviolet light. When it was too hot, we would have gone in the shade. We were never putting on chemical sunscreens. We were simply going in the shade when it was too hot, and then following that day, we would have got more red light. So the red light and the infrared book ending the ultraviolet exposure is both preparing our skin for ultraviolet light, which is mutagenic. That no one's denying that, but it's also healing the skin after that UV exposure. So the point is that when done properly, when done ancestrally, UV light is not killing people. Our ancestors weren't dropping dead at the age of 45 from skin cancer because they were in their ancestral, in their ancestral niche from burning from too much UV light. That's preposterous. They were perfectly adapted to their environment, and the way that they were getting UV light in the context of these other wavelengths was perfectly balanced and therefore perfectly optimized. And the challenge that we have and your listeners have is to try and get back to, or try and understand where we fit in terms of that structure to avoid things like skin cancer and therefore get as physiological and ancestrally appropriate light exposures as we can. The topic of food and sunburn is very, very interesting, and one that people might intuitively know if they've ever gone through the process of eliminating highly refined seed oils from their diet. And photosensitivity seems to be one of the most important things that people notice, or a reduction in photosensitivity or likelihood of burning. We know that what we eat influences our sunburn, and we know that through medications. There's a range of medications, things like the antibiotic doxycycline, things like the anti-acne medication isotretinoin. These are photosensitizing medications, so that we know that what we're intaking can influence our ability to sunburn. But what is fascinating is that when we reduce the amount of seed oils in our diet, the same effect seems to be occurring, and people can tolerate more sun, more ultraviolet light without burning. There is science and there is research to back up this finding, which is when we increase the omega-3 and animal-derived sources of omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids like docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA, when we increase that relative to an EPA, relative to linoleic acid and other omega-6 fatty acids, that has been shown experimentally to improve the outcome of people with specific photosensitive conditions. And that gets all the way back to this idea of we had an ancestrally appropriate omega-3 to 6 ratio based on what was available in our environment. But the modern age, everyone is eating fries, deep fried in soy oil or corn oil or sunflower oil, and that was grown under monoculture, imported or transported from the site of production, and obviously highly refined. So, and I'm glad you brought it up, because it really points to the fact that we need to watch our diet if we're going to use the sun appropriately, and maximizing wild-caught sources of omega-3 fatty acids and minimizing industrial sources of omega-6 fatty acids is a key part of the process.
For somebody that wants to maximize what we've talked about so far, getting out in the sun in the morning, getting that exposure on the skin in the eyes, How important is it to have the whole body exposed? Because I would assume for most people at best, they're going to take their shirt off. They're going to get, sun on their back, on their chest, on their face, and in their eyes, arms. I guess we could go on and on depending. But how important is it to get it in, areas where the sun typically don't shine?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll make the point that one of the cleavage products of that POMC master peptide hormone is called beta endorphin. What beta endorphin is, it's actually a opioid-like chemical. So it's an endogenous opioid. It was a way that the body evolved to reward ourselves, and the so-called runner's high is release of an endorphin-like chemicals. What happens is when we are in ultraviolet light is POMC gets cleaved and beta endorphin gets released. So your body rewards you for getting into ultraviolet light with a hit of endorphin. That's the physiology. So straight off the bat, anyone who is brushing ultraviolet light with a kind of pathological brush needs to reassess their priors if they can't fit that observation about physiology and biology into their mental models. But to answer your question, it will depend on specifically if we're trying to heal a condition. And the point is that red light and morning infrared is incredibly healing, so much so that the whole field of photobiomodulation it relies on taking those longer light wavelengths and putting them in panels, putting them in torches, putting them in saunas, and using them therapeutically. So the morning light, if you have conditions like eczema, psoriasis, any form of dermatological condition, is massively improved by getting that early morning light. And again, if you're sick, if you need to drastically realign your circadian rhythm, if you've got a lot of healing to do, then taking your clothes off and being there in the sun is key. In terms of the more sensitive places, if you think about it, they weren't privileged. They weren't excluded from sun exposure in our ancestral past. So it is the fact that we're wearing clothes, and particularly wearing clothes there, is a historical anomaly. And the fact or the effect of infrared light on the body is that it increases the production of melatonin in our mitochondria of every cell that get exposed to it. And that this goes into a very interesting finding, which is that it's not just the pineal gland that makes melatonin to put us to sleep at night, but rather melatonin is being made everywhere in our body on exposure to infrared, especially during the day, when we get this infrared light, and it's acting as an antioxidant. And if you think about, the mitochondria are generating reactive oxygen species as a byproduct of simple, oxidative phosphorylation and doing their job. The infrared light is acting as like essentially a coolant to kind of cool down the engine, but therefore, getting infrared light on areas of the body that need healing is essentially one of the reasons why that works, is because we're helping to generate local production of antioxidants in that tissue in real time, right there and then. So things like boosting fertility, sure, get the sun on that area. Don't burn, be sensible about it. But historically, there wasn't an area of the body that was privileged from sun exposure. And it's a process of what I call building up a solar callus, which is the process of gradually exposing our body to increasing amount of full spectrum sunlight, including ultraviolet light, that allows us to tolerate that light without burning and allows us to harness all these benefits of sunlight as safely as possible.
You mentioned quickly the panels people can buy for in the house, and then saunas, which, there's different types, but you're referring to infrared saunas. How do you feel about those being therapeutic? And obviously, again, like we said before, nature's best, but do you feel like these are good tools for us to have on hand to, again, hack our biology?
I do, and I really refer people to the work of Dr. Michael Hamblin. He's kind of the world leader when it comes to photobiomodulation, and the clinical role of these is incredibly exciting. And what I mean by that is there's just mounting evidence for applications like wound healing, obviously dermatological conditions, muscle recovery, all kinds of clinical indications for photobiomodulation. So I definitely think it has a place. And I'm more inclined to think that the sicker someone is, or the more frank illness they have, the more we can justify using these narrowband infrared kind of wavelengths rather than the more broader band that you get from the sun. So yeah, I think it definitely has a role. And the evidence is kind of growing and growing and growing about the benefits of it. So it's one pillar of this light as medicine story, and it's so exciting to think that we can help diabetic foot wounds heal up quicker simply by standing in front of a panel or putting a photobiomodulation device over it. And I'm very, very excited for that. As for individuals, as I say, I always encourage people to get the real thing first. But there's protocols for incorporating photobiomodulation panels and things into your regime for sure.
We've talked about a lot of different types of light. We have our visible light, we have our infrared light, our UV light, the latter two being the ones that we don't see. I think at this point, it would be good to get us all on the same page and take me through morning to night and at different times of day, what different exposure we're getting of these types of light.
Yeah. So light is a form of electromagnetic radiation. That is what it is. And it's electromagnetic radiation that is uniquely emitted from the sun and filtered through our atmosphere to reach Earth. The reason why that's important is because when we step outside that Goldilocks zone, or that evolutionary Goldilocks zone, that is when we get sick. And so there's the spectrum that we get when we're essentially on Earth is around 300 or just under 300, which is in the ultraviolet B range. It comes up, and as the wavelength lengthens, it goes from UVB to UVA, and then to red, and then all the colors through blue. And it starts at ultraviolet, it goes to violet, then it goes to purple, cyan purple, blue, green, and then all the way, yellow, orange, red. And red is at the longer wavelength, and infrared then progresses out from there. So what we're getting in terms of terrestrial electromagnetic radiation is all the way from just under 300 to beyond 1,500, 2,000 in terms of nanometers. And of that, 400 to 700 is visible. So you've got a 5% of 5 to 7% of photons are below visible, they're ultraviolet. You've got just under half are visible, and then more than half, the other half, are actually non-visible infrared. So that gives you an idea about what is a healthy light diet, just for what people should expect. That is what we need biologically. When we step outside that, we get sick. So ultraviolet C is incredibly damaging, but it gets filtered by the ozone layer. But if you were exposed to ultraviolet C, which gets used sometimes in germicidal applications, there were some antiviral kind of designs that got manufactured in the past 4 years that helped filter the air by using UVC to kill the germs. That's a problem. And then if you step anywhere outside that, you're going to cause disease. And it's another whole topic, but non-native electromagnetic fields are essentially cell phone radiation, radio frequency radiation, X-rays, gamma rays. Those are all forms of non-native EMF that are also problematic because we're not essentially evolved for those particularly. But to answer your question, the morning starts with the red and the infrared predominantly, and blue, balanced blue, and then depending on where you are in the world, will depend on whether you, and the season will depend on whether you get UV B light. So UVA comes first, and then UVB at peaks at the zenith, which is essentially when at noon, where the sun's overhead, and the filtering of the atmosphere is going to determine how much, and the angle of the sun in the atmosphere determines that UV yield. So, and then the process symmetrically reverses itself into evening. So you can measure this, or it gets measured with things like a spectroscope, which can tell you exactly these wavelengths. But to not get weighed down by the minutiae, the only, all that to say that for people to understand is that each one of these wavelengths is essentially medicinally active. Each one of them is a special signal for your eye, for your brain, for your skin, and each one of them is a packet of information that helps your body, your mitochondria, and your system operate more efficiently. And again, the sicker we are, the more of that information we need to collect to stave off disease.
All right. So, talk about what in an ideal situation we would do light diet throughout the day. We focus a lot on the morning up to this point. And then for somebody in the West who is working a typical job and they're, stuck indoors a lot of the day, the best way they can go about sampling that light to optimize their health.
So the morning routine, after we've blocked blue light before the sun has risen, we've stepped outside, we've got morning sunlight, we've eaten a nutrient dense breakfast soon after waking, and then if we have to go to work, then what the strategies for work are, again in that kind of 3Ms framework, is to go out for sun breaks during the day. And historically people went out to smoke cigarettes. We don't do that anymore, but you can still claim that you need to go out for your own health, and that is simply to sample the ambient, solar, the electromagnetic radiation of the sun, and to collect your download. You're collecting a solar download as frequently as you can throughout that day. You're checking in, and you're helping to synthesize a bunch of, depending on the time of day, neurotransmitters, hormones, everything that we've talked about. When you're inside, again, try and keep the artificial lights to a minimum. If you have windows, open the windows. Set your workstation up on veranda, in front of a big window, in front of a sliding door, anywhere where you can get ambient light into the room, such that the screen or the monitor or your overhead light is not the predominant light source, because your brain and your body they're able to collect, and due to the physics of it, when a window is open, that light is very readily able to essentially dilute what is being emitted from your device. But you have to be in a position where you can make that possible. So turn off those lights, get windows open, step outside as much as you can, and if you can also just reduce the amount of devices that you have close to you, or on your person. So move the Wi-Fi router a little bit further than 30 centimeters away from you. Maybe don't have your Apple Watch and your VR headset and everything turned, and your phone right next to your ear, because they're emitting blue light, which is a form of non-native EMF, as well as these radio frequency radiation. Throughout the evening, when you get home, then we need to protect those circadian signals by blocking blue light after dark, putting on things like blue light blocking glasses, because we don't want any blue light to trick our body into thinking it's still daytime, or to thinking it's still midday. So that is a really critical part about it. And just getting our meal timing in, not too far, ideally 3 hours, 4 hours, but not too far past dinner, past sunset, and to essentially go to sleep not too far past sunset, as much as is possible.
All right, a couple points I want to get into within that. You mentioned the fact that we need to open the window. Talk more about the physiology of somebody that till this point has been relying on getting their light through a window, how there's certain aspects that are blocked there.
Yeah, so it gets to this idea of filtration, and anytime that we are putting a substance or a material in between our eyes and the sun, we're going to get some form of filtration. So modern forms of lighting block ultraviolet. They block they block mostly UVB. They let some UVA in, depending on the manufacturer, and they block a lot of infrared. So people are getting proportionally a lot more blue light in relative to what their body needs, by simply being inside, behind glass. So glass is not ideal. We can't expect to get the appropriate circadian and signals by being behind glass. So what that essentially does is, it can increase our UVA exposure. Again, not good for things like photoaging and things like skin cancer. It's not good for all those other reasons why we might want to have red and infrared. So it's profoundly unhelpful, and it's not physiological. So the act of opening that window, in terms of the light signals that our eye receives, really, really improves things. But to still avoid getting that form of filtered light on our skin is preferable too. So, I mean, do what you can, and I would think it is it's a game of simply, again, better, or don't let perfection be the goal here. We're simply just trying to make incremental improvements, and the value of simply opening the window to get that appropriate light signal is enormous.
You mentioned wearing blue light blockers at night. I know depending on the situation, you wear different glasses during the day if you're working on devices. Talk about the two different types and when you'll wear the ones during the day.
Yeah, so this gets to the idea that there's some amount of blue light is necessary and physiological, and your body needs that blue, especially in the middle of the day. So the yellow tinted lenses are permitting a certain amount of blue light to enter the eye, but they're just kind of attenuating the peak and of that blue light that you're getting, that's being emitted from artificial light sources. Whereas the orange and the red lenses, they're blocking almost all blue light, and that's most relevant for nighttime, because remember those blue light detecting cells in your eye, the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, are extremely sensitive to blue wavelength light. And if there's light like that present, they will tell the body to switch off making melatonin from the pineal gland. And the process of rest and repair of autophagy, apoptosis, those cellular garbage cleaning processes, they'll get interfered with if we're experiencing or exposed to artificial light at night. So the value of the red and orange lenses is to wear once the sun has gone down, to make sure that the bare minimum of blue light is entering the eye and therefore affecting our circadian biology.
How do you feel about the different software you can get for devices? I know for Apple, there's Night Shift that is something that's native on the devices. And there's another program I use on my laptop called Iris. How valuable are those?
So they have a role, but I wouldn't encourage people to hang their hat on them. And that the reason for that is, if you hold a spectroscope to these devices, even on their red mode, yes, they're emitting red light, but they're still emitting blue wavelength light, and your body can recognize that, because it's simply a blend of those different light wavelengths. So it is good. It's better than the factory settings for sure, but it isn't something to kind of reassure yourself and pat yourself on the head that there's nothing more to do. And yeah, as we alluded to previously, you can't be up till 10 p.m. With Netflix blaring, simply with a red iPad screen, and thinking that you're still doing the best thing for your health. So it's a workaround, it's a mitigation measure, but it's still not ideal.
So at nighttime, you're putting on your red or your orange glasses. Take me through, again, you're not watching Netflix on your iPad till all hours of the night, but take me through all the different variables and things you're doing at night to mitigate the unnatural light.
Yeah, so It's about cultivating as low a light environment as possible. Because if we, again, think about circadian biology, what did our body expect? It expected nothing, no light at night, or essentially moonlight as the only nocturnal night source. And even firelight came relatively quite late in our ancestral past. So the less light that's present, the better. And what that essentially looks like is using red globes if we need to do work, using candles if we can, putting our light closer to the ground, because it's even the position of the light that can also impact the signals that sends to our body about time of day. The fact that light overhead was always associated with daytime and wakefulness. So it's always good if you can to get that light at night closer to the ground. So the room is very much dimmer. If you're elderly, be careful. We don't want you falling over and hurting yourself. But it's as low a light environment as people can tolerate based on what they need to do. And we've eaten, again, maybe at sunset or soon after sunset. We're not doing stimulating activities, kind of trying to wind down, minimizing tech and device usage, employing our blue light blocking glasses for any devices that we're still using. And that is a good evening routine, because it is maintaining and minding that those circadian signals, and that those need to have a lower light environment at night.
Let's come back to our morning and talk about the food input. You mentioned having, I think it was a high protein, high fat meal about a half hour after waking. A lot of people these days in the health and wellness space are talking about the benefits of intermittent fasting and putting off that first meal until lunch or even later, depending. Let's talk about, from your perspective, the importance of that food input earlier than later.
Yeah, people like to, especially low carb and carnivore, like to advocate for a time restricted eating window that basically says you can push back your time of first meal to 1 p.m., 2 p.m., 3 p.m., and that's not no big deal. I would suggest that those people do not understand that food is itself this zeitgeber, this secondary zeitgeber that is influencing circadian entrainment, and when it is consumed that late, it means that the eating window typically gets pushed back. It gets pushed back till maybe the final meals at 8 p.m. or even later. And that is not ideal from a circadian timing point of view. Like I mentioned, we want to cease putting food in our GI tract, 3 to 4 hours before we sleep. And again, to keep that consistent with when ancestry would be hunting and when we would be active. So the benefit of earlier morning food consumption is that we can still do a time restricted eat, especially if we're doing lower carb type diet. But you just eat at breakfast, and you eat at maybe 2 p.m., 3 p.m., 4 p.m. So you can do it, but you just do it on the other end. And the guide of when to stop eating or what time is right for you is going to depend on if you're getting hungry at night. And if you're getting so hungry that you're it's interfering with your sleep quality, then you need to either eat more or push that eating window a little bit later in the day. But the benefits of this approach is, again, respecting our circadian signals, but sleep quality is improved. And people typically find that when they're eating too late, they don't even realize how much better their sleep quality could get by simply not be actively digesting just as they're laying down, because that is not what the system was designed for.
How do you feel about snacking in between meals or having mini meals to, supplement the diet?
I think it's often working against us if we're trying to reestablish leptin sensitivity and essentially lose weight. So again, depending on what our goal is here, if you're trying to win a bodybuilding competition, then yes, you're going to need to snack and eat regularly. But if the goal here is to reestablish our metabolic health and resolve any kind of underlying insulin resistance and by extension leptin resistance, then that is again, it's really going against what we want to be doing. So I'm much more in favor of eating a smaller number of larger meals um, in an earlier morning time restricted eating window, whether that's 6 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours. Again, individual depending, but the combination of eating those larger, fewer meals and focusing on animal protein and animal fat seems to be a very powerful way to help people deal with, to feel full, to deal with food cravings. And if we're getting those sunlight signals at the same time, remember that I mentioned about the effect of UV light on making that key compound alpha MSH, is that if we're getting the correct sun signals in conjunction with that lower carb diet, earlier seasonal diet, earlier in the day, then in my mind, that is a solution to food addiction. It is a root cause solution to food addiction and to overeating. And I would, really challenge someone who has experienced something like, binge eating or food cravings to really do that combination of food timing, light signals, and lower carb seasonal diet. And I would assume that would fix almost all case of food craving or dysregulated kind of appetite. And not obviously not talking about things like bulimia and anorexia. We're not talking about those clinical cases. I'm talking more specifically about general food addiction here.
We've talked about the variance in the diet depending on latitude. How much variance is there for somebody, say, in Canada versus living in Florida? We'll use that example again. Are you advocating for a low carb diet either way? And then the carbs coming in, if you're closer to the equator, just being a small portion of the diet? I just want to get more of a feel for the diet as a whole.
Yeah, I think again. So if say for you, Jesse, you don't have any kind of visceral fat, you're not on the spectrum of metabolic disease. If what you could eat in Canada would in winter, you obviously again forming the basis with locally sourced say beef. It's an or deer, venison. I'm a big fan of wild caught game. That's all very local. It's rich in animal protein and animal fat. But if you were to eat a tubers or locally grown tubers, and it didn't make you feel any worse, you still were thriving with that, eating those type of foods or some kind of fermented food, then I would say, go on, keep doing what you're doing. But what if you were to, start importing Californian oranges, at the same time and drinking, half a liter of orange juice every morning, I think that pretty soon you would either not feel too great or you would start laying down, fat in the wrong places. And because of the profound mismatch between the light environment, the season, the temperature, and everything that we've mentioned. But if you being down there in Florida, you might find that you still want to mainly eat steaks, whatever makes you feel the best. But and that's kind of the nuance, is that it's still probably, a 60, 70, 80% diet that's based on animal protein and fat. But that 20, 30% is the variation that you get from that the latitude, or at least that's what I see. So it's finely tuned. And again, if you're metabolically sick, if you're floridly type 2 diabetic, then eating fruit and honey it's going to slow your progress down. And if we're trying to get you metabolically healthy, even at a equatorial latitude, it's just going to take longer.
Up until this point, when we've talked about latitude, we've used it as a marker for how many carbohydrates we can allow into the diet healthily. And of course, there's different variables, how metabolically healthy the person is or not. But how do you look at actual local foods to that region?
Yeah, it's a good question. And heuristically, it's easily solved by simply sourcing from a local farmer. Because if you buy at a local market, farmer's market, you have a farmer, a rancher that grows your food, then you can simply ask him, what's supposed to be grown at this time of year, and you've kind of got your answer. To add a bit more nuance and detail, I still think that we need to be careful if we're sourcing non-animal food products from industrial or monocropped food supply chains, because the fact that we're living at a lower latitude, and the fact that the way that plants are grown is that we obviously want to be sourcing organically and as high quality as we can. And I don't want to minimize or diminish the fact that the contamination of vegetables and grains with agricultural herbicides, potentially things like mycotoxins, etc., is a problem. So I would also err in the side of eating a more animal-based diet if it meant that we're sourcing foods that have been sprayed or contaminated or have other form of undesirable food chain contaminants kind of on them. But if in terms of local sourcing, and again, this is contingent upon one, that we can get high quality food, two, that it makes us feel good. And I don't want anyone to feel like they have to include seasonal food. If they just feel better eating meat, then just eat, that's appropriate for you. So be in tune with your local, what feels good, and your local food environment. But the great thing about, again, meeting those food growers is that you kind of solve for all these confusing problems at the same time, which is going straight to the source and buy what is grown there. And that way you can talk to these farmers. You can ask them if they use things like various agricultural industrial inputs into either growing plants or raising cattle, antibiotics. And look, it's very difficult for a farmer to look you in the eye and lie in your face. Like, that's not going to happen. So the transparency that we get from local direct sourcing is enormous and incredibly beneficial. So that would be something I very much advocate for, and it makes this lifestyle much, much, much easier.
Let's get into food quality, specifically when it comes to meat. And it seems like a lot of people in the carnivore space aren't as concerned when it comes to getting grass-fed, grass-finished. I know specifically you, Paul Saladino, there are a number of people that do really consider the quality. Why is that so important?
There's a couple of points here, and I think it gets to not only food as medicine, but also the type of world we're trying to create here. And if we have the luxury, or we have the ability to source food from a regenerative farm that is going to cost more money, then that dollar spent, in my mind, is a very, very worthwhile investment, not only in the most healthy food, but also to help incentivize an economic system that is empowering local communities, that is producing more of the same food. And I have several friends who are regenerative farmers, and the more people that buy their produce, the larger they can scale their operation, the more that they can afford to buy organic grain for their pigs and chickens. And that's an interesting one, is because the larger the scale, the more they have bargaining power with, say, their suppliers, to therefore improve the quality of the feed that are fed to the animals, as in consequence. So there's a kind of societal aspect to it, but there's also the food, quality and quantity itself. So I think that for people who are hanging on, they're just barely getting by, or they've come from a standard American diet, Australian diet, and they're making baby steps, or they're starting out, I don't have a problem with them sourcing meat from whatever source they can get. But the progression should be, if wherever possible, towards meat that they know where it's come from. It's not an agglomeration of 200 animals that's come out of a Tyson factory, and with God knows what concoction of contaminants in there. And that the progression should be, in my mind, towards finding out a local farmer, going on a weekend trip, meeting that person, and then eventually stocking a freezer up. The specific nutritional value of grass-fed versus grain-fed beef is established in a couple of ways. One of them is through the omega-3 to 6 ratio of fully grass-fed beef. And I'm a strong advocate for seafood, and because it's the most bioavailable and rich the source of DHA particularly. but we can get it from land-based ruminants and animals, but it's going to be higher in fully grass-fed animals. Another interesting facet is the deuterium concentration of the meat, and we haven't mentioned deuterium up till now, but essentially deuterium is a heavy hydrogen isotope, and it is present naturally in the environment. And when our body has certain steps, specifically within the mitochondria, and when it is making energy, to exclude deuterium from the process of energy generation. And if anyone remembers, there's the fifth complex in the electron transport chain involves pumping up hydrogens against and basically creating an electrochemical gradient for them to flow back down through. So the problem is that if you have a deuterium instead of a deuteron instead of a hydrogen, it's essentially double the mass of that hydrogen, and it wrecks the ability of that proton, that wheel essentially, to spin, the ATPase. So what the body tries to do is to exclude deuterium from the food source as much as it can. And what that translates to in terms of our diet is that foods that are industrially refined, foods that are grown under artificial conditions, and are going to be enriched in deuterium relative to the most deuterium depleted foods, which are grass-fed butter, grass-fed animal fat. And that is because these natural systems, the cow, the animal fat, the animal itself, has gone through the process of deuterium depletion so that we don't have to do it for ourselves. So that is one way of thinking about the carnivore diet as a healing protocol, which is, it is simply the most deuterium depleted diet. It is the lowest deuterium diet. And fundamentally, on a mitochondrial level, if we're thinking about all these chronic diseases, these metabolic problems, there's various shades of mitochondrial dysfunction, then any diet that reduces stress on those mitochondria by reducing the deuterium intake is going to be a good thing. So the work of Dr. Laszlo Boros, who is a Hungarian researcher and world expert on deuterium, his research has shown that the fully grass-fed animals, in this situation, he was looking at Jersey cattle, they had significantly lower levels of deuterium in the meat if they were fully grass-fed compared to grain-fed and grain-finished animals. So that is kind of probably the main way or lens that I look through meat quality, and why I encourage people to source from a food quality point of view, which is trying to get this lower deuterium foods. And I think that understanding the benefits, or understanding deuterium, really gives us more of a idea about why this is a healthy diet. And attacks, or I guess arguments against saturated animal fat for human consumption, really doesn't include this idea of the effect of deuterium and the effect of a deuterium depleted diet on mitochondrial function and mitochondrial water production, which is another whole story. But to keep it simple, and I like to keep it simple, is if we're eating our natural diet, which is ruminant herbivores and wild-caught seafood and wild-caught ruminants, then our food should be eating its ancestral diet. And ruminant has a rumen, it's for eating grass. So that's why, to me, it makes just sense that the cow should be eating the grass and not a grain that was raised under Roundup Ready conditions that had glyphosate sprayed all over it, and other forms of kind of novel food technology and industrialization processes.
All right. So food quality matters. And you mentioned when it comes to animal products, we need to prioritize, at least to a point, seafood. Talk about the hierarchy of animal foods and how you look at getting that diversity in within, say, a week or a month.
It's something that I've changed my mind on recently. And I used to be mainly kind of thinking that we the land-based food web was kind of sufficient. And perhaps for some people, some situations in the past, it was sufficient. But even if you look back through the records, there were, in terms of ancestral peoples, there were tribes that specifically sought out animal foods, and especially, that sought out seafoods and food from the marine food web, even if they weren't directly in the ocean. So to me, that really points to the value of those foods for human evolution. And looking into the work of Professor Michael Crawford is incredibly insightful, because his work essentially provides very, very interesting and strong evidence that the development of the brain, our brains as mammals, was reliant on the presence of an abundant amount of DHA in our diets. And one way to think about this is that the mammals have and to varying degrees, have a limited ability to synthesize DHA in our own bodies. So we have a very small and inefficient way of converting the precursor fatty acids into DHA, but essentially we need to consume them preformed. So what one way of thinking about this, or illustrating, is that the zebra and the dolphin both are similar body weights, but one of them has a brain that's around 400, 380, 400 grams, the zebra, and the dolphin's brain is around 1.8 kilograms. So there's a massive discrepancy in the brain size, despite the fact that these mammals are weighing the same amount. And it points to the role of DHA, and specifically the fact that DHA hasn't been replaced in the central nervous system of animals in essentially since it evolved 600 million years ago. And the reason for that, and it gets into some quantum biology that is quite complex, is that the structure of the molecule has essentially what are known as photon traps that allow it to harness light photons and light energy and transmit that as a DC electric current, which basically allows us to develop a nervous system. So DHA is critical for eye development, it's critical for brain development, it's critical for the transduction of light signals into the brain. And the modern environment that we live in, which is rich in this artificial light, blue light, increases or accelerates the destruction of DHA in the retina and in our central nervous system. So the requirement of us to consume these sources of preformed DHA from the marine food web has increased, given the context and the lifestyle that many of us live today. So for those reasons, and to again give people an idea, that the thought is that ancestrally women would have been essentially harvesting or foraging at the shores of lakes and the seashore, essentially picking up sources of shellfish, mussels, these types of foods during their pregnancies, and before, during, and after their pregnancies. And that DHA was therefore abundantly available. So while the men were out hunting and getting variable amounts of, successful kill, yes, you take down a large predator, but how much DHA is in the brain? Yeah, there is some, but nowhere near on the order of bioavailable DHA that you would get from foraging at the sea. And the fact is that having that amount in the diet was enabling the offspring to therefore enrich that DHA in the central nervous systems and develop the amount of intelligence that we have now. So in terms of thinking about the hierarchy, I still think what works for a lot of people is that the basis of the diet is a really high quality grass-fed ruminant herbivore like beef, usually quite fatty. So beef is preferable for that reason, but also things like venison, goat, lamb, and then as that is the basis of the diet, and then adding in freshly caught seafood, locally caught seafood, oysters, where possible, maybe 3 times a week if you're close or if you can afford it, and maybe once a week if it's a little bit more effort. Around the time of pregnancy, I'm a massive advocate for being very, very intentional with seafood intake. And it's a controversial topic because in Australia and in America, there's specific recommendations to avoid the consumption of raw seafood during pregnancy. Doesn't exist in Japan. There is guidelines in Japanese antenatal care that specifically talk about sashimi. So it's a very cultural dependent and cultural kind of point that in our society we discourage the consumption of raw seafood, but in ancestral societies and in Japan it's very favorable. So the value of it, especially in pregnancy, in my mind, can't be overlooked, and everyone needs to make their own risk versus benefit decision about whether to include a food like that. But things like cod liver, purified high quality cod liver oil can be one source. But things like fish roe, so like salmon roe, trout roe, again, not cheap, but very, very nutrient dense source of DHA, and essentially what the Inuit would give to their pregnant women during their pregnancies. So, and do what you can. Again, it's not cheap, but this is medicine. Food is medicine, light is medicine, and you can get these natural nutrients now, or you can, deal with the consequences and chronic disease later down the track.
You mentioned cod liver oil there. Given the critical importance of DHA and how disruptive our modern environment is for DHA, how much can we rely on supplements such as cod liver oil, fish oil, to get that DHA and other nutrients from marine life?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And the concern I have is that most of the supplements on the market are oxidized. And the process of extracting and refining these oils, just because they're omega-3 and not omega-6, doesn't make them immune to the problems of lipid peroxidation that occur with linoleic acid and all these industrially refined oils. So I really only recommend one kind of brand of very, very very, very purified, cold pressed kind of cod liver oil, but it's always going to be number two to regularly eating fresh seafood. So the combination of the circadian things that we talked about, the morning sunrise, which you can get abundantly easily when you live by the sea, eating sources of fresh seafood like fish, like mussels, like octopus, like shellfish. That process is incredibly beneficial for anyone anyone's full stop, but particularly with mood problems, anxiety, depression, and any kind of brain issue, because we're giving the brain the most bioavailable food nutrients and not only DHA, but iodine, selenium, zinc, iron, as well as the most essentially readily accessed light nutrients, which you get when you can watch the sunrise on the beach. So this gets to that idea of being intentional with where we live. And if our health is on the line, sometimes we need to move if that is going to mean the difference between sickness and health.
For somebody that's going to include a cod liver oil supplement, what's the brand you recommend?
Rosita.
And is that available obviously in Australia, but worldwide?
It is, and I had no affiliation with them at all. So that's just one that I've found to be the least likely to, the most adherent in terms of thinking about these practices of extraction that try and minimize chance of lipid peroxidation.
So the diet template we've talked about so far is on the lower carb spectrum, all the way to carnivore. What that brings up for me is gut health, because a lot of the people in the health and wellness space are saying more plants, getting a diverse arrangement of different colors and different plants to feed the gut. So how do you look at the gut microbiome and this way of eating specifically that you're recommending? How does that impact it?
I think the major point about about gut health that no one, or that very few people are talking about or recognizing, is the fact of its external influences. And that gets back to this idea of um, our environment modulating our circadian health, and it also plays a key role in gut health. And the reason being is because we have circadian clock timing mechanism in our enterocytes in our gut, and like I mentioned earlier, and if your circadian health is dialed and your light signals are dialed, then your gut barrier integrity is better. That is something that we know, that circadian disruption induces gut barrier function. It influences enterocyte turnover. So, and the fact of getting sunlight on the belly is counterintuitive, but would probably be the first thing that I recommend for someone to improve their gut health. And similarly, there is data that shows the influence of sun on the microbiome, and the fact that the variation of microbiome, I believe in the Hadza populations, was surprisingly little, surprisingly littly varying with food, but was more a factor of their light environment. So, addressing our circadian rhythm, addressing our light environment, fixing gut permeability by getting correct light signals, number one, and then looking at factors that increase gut permeability. Obviously, alcohol, medications, things like coffee isn't the best, and also glyphosate, industrial herbicidal contaminants. These factors can all have a negative effect on gut health and gut permeability. If we haven't dealt with those things, those factors that I've just listed, and we're trying to shove you know, plant matter into the GI tract without having first corrected those issues, and perhaps even, inactivated some of those toxins through processes like fermentation, and then we're really setting ourselves up to, in my opinion, to exacerbate underlying gut problems like irritable bowel syndrome, because of the effect of things like lectins on the GI tract. So, the degree to which they might affect you can probably be reduced by having that circadian rhythm dialed, but in the process of healing and just by general life, that if it is suitable for you based on how you feel, it's probably best not to include those foods. And I'd actually advise the opposite. I don't think that a large amount of fiber, undigestible, insoluble fiber or plant fiber is ideal, and certainly not necessary for optimal gut function. And the interesting thing is, again, circadian rhythms will influence our gut motility. So people ask the question about, oh, well, how will I go to the toilet if I'm only eating meat? Well, the answer in part is that if you're hydrating appropriately and you've gotten your morning sunlight signals, your gut will know exactly what to do at the right time, and that isn't something you have to worry about. But I also agree with the more carnivore approach stance, which is, if you assess the trade-offs anthropologically and physiologically that our gut made, and adaptations to meat consumption, when we look at things like prey animals like the large cats, they don't have a problem pooping, and theirs is almost completely, is a carnivorous type diet. So, no, I don't think fiber is necessary. And people commonly tell me that their bowel motions improve when they cut those foods out.
You quickly touched on the importance of hydration, and we know how you feel about coffee now. Talk about how you look at hydration as a whole and what you do to optimize that in your life.
Hydration is, again, best served, and I'm gonna maybe put out the ideal, and then we can work from ideal to less ideal. I think sourcing from a local spring is probably the best type of water you could drink, and it's going to come with a range of minerals that is appropriate and healthy in its own way. I think that drinking to thirst of high quality mineral water or high quality filtered water that's been remineralized is appropriate. I'm not prescriptive in terms of the amount of liters or anything that I think people should drink. I think that it should be tailored to our activity levels, and to thirst, and preferably to just sourcing a high quality spring water to start with. But the point about coffee actually ties into this idea of leptin resistance and this circadian dysfunction, because the combination of the morning coffee on the empty stomach, trying to do a time restricted eat, at the same time as looking at the iPhone, uh, first thing in the morning. To me, that is a holy trinity of circadian disrupting, metabolism disrupting behaviors that people do these days. And the reason is because coffee is essentially it is a phytotoxin. Let's not pretend it isn't. It's an evolved substance to defend against insect attack by the plant, and it just so happens that we have harnessed it, we've cultivated it, and societally sanctioned its routine consumption. But the fact of the matter is, it has these effects on our physiology that are basically doing the opposite of signaling abundance. And if we think about the morning breakfast that we're encouraging, which is rich in animal fat and protein, to really signal that there's an environmental abundance. If we're starving ourselves to 1 p.m. and drinking black coffee on an empty stomach, that's very much orthogonal to those stated goals. So, not to say I'm completely anti coffee, but in terms of the big ticket items that I think people might be unintentionally getting wrong, is coffee is up there, and simply replacing the coffee with that morning spring water, replacing it with something like a bone broth first thing in the morning, just before or with breakfast, is much more conducive to gut health and to general well-being, and the leptin resistance problem that I touched on earlier.
Talk about what some of those other big ticket items you see people get wrong in the health world.
Yeah, I would say the phone addiction, tech addiction could probably be number one, and the fact that people don't realize that every time they are staring at the device, they are sending such a profoundly ancestrally inappropriate light signal. So that's number one, top of the list, especially the first thing in the morning, last thing in bed, and the cumulative effect on our biology of doing that over a period of decades is it's frankly highly destructive, and it's actually quite worrying to think about future generations who are growing up in these key developmental periods with artificial light, not sunlight, as the main type of light that is orchestrating their physiology. And we didn't talk specifically about these various functions of leptin, but leptin is not only a satiety hormone. Even though it's synthesized by your fat cells, it also influences fecundity and fertility. It affects the sex hormone synthesis. It affects bone metabolism. It affects immune function. So dysregulation of leptin and being resistant to leptin by this circadian disrupted processed food environment is having very, very profound effects. But I think at the top of the list of these health issues that people are unwittingly putting themselves through is, it's clearly above and beyond is the blue light and the non-native EMF, and the fact that your mitochondria sensing the environment, they're expecting one form of electromagnetic frequency, and they're getting basically a toxic soup of radio frequency radiation, electromagnetic radiation that is completely foreign to them. So that and then down the list, 5, 6, 7, 8, you've got things like Teflon pans, and the fact that everyone's heating their food up in plastics and exposing themselves to chemical endocrine disruptors and commodity foods. But I really think that the light story is the number one story here, and our ability to deal with those other toxins is massively improved when our solar redox is high, when our light signals are on point.
So it sounds like from our whole discussion here, the two main areas people need to focus on is light and then food. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's why I really summarize it. I say that you need to look after your light diet, your food diet, and your light diet. Just like there's junk food, there's junk light, and you can't out eat a junk light diet, no matter what the quality of your food is. So that's the package that I offer to people, and it doesn't involve running, doing a CrossFit at 6 a.m. at the gym under artificial lights. That's not helping you. Solving for these two fundamental food and light inputs, that is how we correct things, in my opinion, at the most basic fundamental level. And if you notice about your other guests that you've had on, everything their approach, I believe, builds on that because the light and the food diet is correcting those mitochondrial inputs, and the mitochondrial inputs of temperature, light, food. Once they are all normalized and they are working well, then everything else is downstream. Everything else is downstream metabolically, bioenergetically of helping those mitochondria work the most efficiently. And it's predominantly a light story, and then the food comes second.
Got it. That's what I was going to ask. If you had to put one at the very top, it'd be light.
Yeah, and it speaks to the idea that the ancestral or the evolutionary impact of light goes so far into the distant past, all the way back to these single cellular prokaryotic organisms that are still modulating their activity, their physiology, based on light and dark cycles. So it's that old, it's that ancient, it's that preserved, and the fact is that people aren't talking about it, and it is the most underappreciated thing. And I get frustrated, or I get when I see people talking so much and being so insistent about dietary approaches, yet they're right under an LED light, and we know what that is doing to mitochondrial physiology. We know that what that's doing to metabolic health and your hormonal axes. So it's almost like drinking the cup while the coffee while the house is burning down. Like let's deal with the most important things first, and then we can argue about the nuances of of all the minutiae. But fix the light environment, and if it involves moving, then sometimes that's necessary.
Well, given the importance of light, and given that most of us are going to be indoors throughout the day, just working jobs and the way that modern life is set up, what are some other swaps? We've talked about the glasses, we've talked about opening the window, but for people that have, say, LED lights above them, is there better bulbs we can change those to? What kind of swaps in the house can we make to create that better light environment throughout the day?
There's a couple of interesting technologies that are coming in that help to put back infrared light into our indoor environment. And remember that if we can't be outside getting bright sunlight, which is, again, more than 50% of the photons are infrared, then simply having artificial light that emits some form of infrared is preferable. It's not ideal, but it's preferable. And back before the banning of halogen and incandescent globes, then we were getting some degree of infrared simply indoors. But in the name of energy efficiency, that got binned, and everyone is therefore existing in this isolated blue environment. So there's a couple of bulbs that put back in infrared. Scott Zimmerman has a brand called Naira that again emit a little bit of infrared. The other option is to balance the kind of spectrum that your eye and skin is receiving by adding in like a red LED globe, which is again giving you it's more of a balanced spectrum for what your eye and skin is receiving. So that's an option, and those would probably be the main two ones. Some people like to use things like a photobiomodulation panel just for ambient use and not kind of therapeutic. That's up to you. I don't necessarily feel too strongly about that. But not to, I think it really, again, these are all workarounds. And if we can do the real thing and get outside or open up our windows, then that's really going to be by far and away the preferable approach.
I think one of the tricky things about light is that it's really hard to see its influence on our health. You can, neglect exercise and then you can look at your arms and see, they're flabby and there's no real muscle there. Or if you're eating processed foods, you're going to tend to, get out of shape and put on all kinds of fat. But with light, it's hard to be objective with it and to see its direct influence on our biology.
It is. It's hard for people and humans in general to appreciate the value or the importance of things that they can't necessarily see. And I guess in terms of spreading the message or communicating the message as much as possible, I think just getting back to what was what our ancestors did. And, if you talk to someone, you ask them, what did your great grandparents do? What was their relationship with light? They would say, oh, they were outside, they were working their job, the whole day, whether they were in a workshop, there was always a window open, or they were in a field, and they were socializing outdoors. They were asleep with the sunset. I mean, I think everyone knows, everyone's great grandparents, great grandparents were doing that. So, and I think that helping people understand or connect back with maybe 3, 4 generations before gives them more of a reference point for what is a healthy light environment. And I think about things like the blue zones, and the blue zones are another hot topic of debate. And you have these armed camps, these barricades that get put up on the various dietary camps, that it's a vegan. The reason is because they eat plant-based. No, it's not. All these ideologies. But the fundamental point that no one is talking about is that these are latitudes. These are closer to the equatorial latitudes, and these people live social lives that are outdoors. They're getting massive amounts of infrared light during the day. They're grounded. Most of them are probably grounded the 80-90% of the time, and they don't have light pollution at night. They don't have blaring halogen or blue LED streetlights. So I think that the blue zones give us, if you interpret them and through the perspective of the light story, then they make a lot of sense, and it becomes more and more clear that the light story and the environmental story is such an important part of optimal health.
All right, Max, I think this is a good place to end it. I really appreciate you coming on the show, sharing your vast knowledge, and we're going to link up your social media, your website, everything in the show notes. And I just want to thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. It's been a pleasure.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Bart. He'll help you sort through the nutrition nonsense. You don't want to miss this. I'll see you over there.
Insulin resistance is a normal, natural, indicated, and useful biological process. It is not a pathology, and it is not the cause.